delighted to have Anthony Cockerill here today, who's the director of a wonderful organisation called NATE, or the National Association for Teachers of English in the UK, a very important professional association, which I've been a member of for many years as an English teacher over the decades. And perhaps we'll talk a little bit about the history of NATE as we go through the podcast. But we today are just going to be looking at, a key question, which is about, what can we as a society learn from English teachers and NATE itself? And we're going to look at some of these kind of key themes about the value of loving literature and reading for pleasure, and the importance of language awareness, how we speak, write and reflect, thinking about storytelling as a pedagogical and professional tool, and how teachers model creativity, empathy and critical thinking, and perhaps the role of NATE in supporting teacher voice, research and community. All quite heavy themes, as it were. Maybe before we go into that, Anthony, you could just give us a tiny bit about your background and, how you became the director of NATE.
Of course. Well, I was a classroom teacher for many years and head of department for the last 10 of those in a school in North Yorkshire, a rural school between York and Harrogate. I've been there for many years and a lot of great kind of opportunities kept coming up, so there was kind of no reason to move on, as much as I know some people like to kind of get a wide experience of different schools. But because of the journey the school was on and the opportunities that came up, I stayed and really was kind of part of that journey. I became head of department in 2014, and that was an interesting time because the new GCSE, what were new at that time anyway, the new GCSE specifications were being launched, and there was new national curriculum reform, and so it was an interesting time to become head of department, and I kind of saw it as a chance to make some really kind of positive changes to the Key Stage 3 curriculum, but also to the way that kind of, I guess, kind of prepared students for GCSE 2. So working with our really supportive local authority advisory team, we as a department set about designing a new curriculum, which we called the thematic curriculum. Much of what I spent all of those years as head of department working on, but certainly a huge kind of burst of energy and input in those first few years was building this thematic curriculum and putting things in place to make sure that it could evolve, it could grow, and I didn't kind of become a stagnant kind of thing. So that was kind of very much the focus of a lot of my work. One of the sort of slightly sad things about the final few years in my time at the school was that our sixth form closed. And having federated with another local school, it made sense, I guess, to put all of the sixth form provision onto one site. It kind of made a lot of sense for a lot of reasons, but unfortunately it meant that myself and my department colleagues were not able to teach A level. So that was hard. That was a difficult thing to sort of have to go through. However, it also kind of freed up a lot of time and space to put back into thinking about Key Stage 3. So I think there was probably a positive impact in that respect, but it was a shame, I think, for colleagues to feel that they were missing out on teaching A level 2. So I was kind of in post until December of last year, and I'd done a fair bit of kind of stuff for NATE over the years. I'd written some articles for Teaching English. I'd spoken at one or two conferences, and I was really keen, I think, to do a new role, and I've never really been ambitious about being on SLT in school, because I'm really an English teacher at my core, and that's where my passion is. So I wasn't really fussed about SLT roles at all. And the NATE job, when it was advertised when my predecessor Jonathan Morgan left, it seemed like a really good opportunity to have an impact on English teaching in a broader sense. But I think the values of NATE have also kind of very much aligned with my own kind of fairly progressive thinking about English teaching too. So it seemed like a good fit, and I was fortunate to get the job and have been in post since January.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, really interesting that you're talking about that. Maybe we'll return to some of these kind of themes that you've already raised. But I
Mm.
guess the first thing we wanted to think about is the value of literature and reading for pleasure. And I was just wondering, as a school teacher for many years, and as obviously a student at some point, uh, and now director of Nate, what are your views on what is the value of reading and responding creatively to literature in your view?
Oh, it's huge. I think hugely important. And I would kind of preface the response to that by saying that I think it's really also important to value all kinds of reading material. So whether
Yeah.
that's kind of, canonical novels, or whether it's graphic
Mm.
novels, or whether it's young adult fiction. I'm pretty kind of open about what students read, and I always encourage students to read widely across a range of different forms, because I think it's
Mm.
important that they're allowed to have that kind of process of discovery, of finding things that they enjoy reading, because I think reading for pleasure potentially is sometimes framed in schools as a thing we're all going to do now. We're all going to read for
Yeah.
pleasure now for the next 20 minutes,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
potentially you may not be feeling it in that moment, or
Yeah. Yeah.
it might be the last thing you want to do. So I think it has to kind of be an authentic reading.
Mm.
Encouraging reading and reading for pleasure has to be an authentic experience. One of my colleagues at my school, Julie Wellock, who is now head of department, has worked closely with the Book Buzz charity, and she did a lot of
Yeah.
really good work in terms of bringing books into year 7 and 8 and giving students choice, and helping them
Mm.
to see that there was lots of different types of books that might appeal to them.
Yeah.
And that was a really good way that I feel that was kind of tackled in the department, and we were very lucky to have a good library at the
Yeah.
school where I work too, and we could, and even through COVID, where times were tough and people couldn't visit the library, we were kind of making up boxes of all kinds of different books for forms and tutor groups to read. So I think definitely having a kind of quite a pluralistic approach to what reading for
Yeah.
pleasure means is definitely important. And then and I think it helps students. I mean, for all kinds of ways, and obviously it helps them to become more fluent readers. It helps them to value
Yeah.
reading, and it helps them to put it simply, it helps them to learn stuff, which is
Yeah.
great. And in terms of your question about kind of responding creatively, I think that's
Yeah.
really, really important. And one of the things that I always have sort of championed for years in terms of the curriculum was the notion that reading and writing are really closely aligned, and
Yeah.
that writing, and certainly responding to what you've read as a writer, is a really important
Mm.
and worthwhile goal in itself.
Yeah. 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 No, all really interesting points. I mean, uh, maybe there's quite a lot to sort of unpack here, isn't there?
Mm,
Maybe we could start with, some of your responses to perhaps this government's and other governments' sort of demand, really, that particularly, teenagers read um, sort of pre-20th century
mm,
texts. And that happened with the GCSE, didn't it? The
mm,
previous government's demand, and the current government seem to have carried that on,
yeah.
don't they? And so there's this idea that there is a certain sort of canon of literature to
Mm,
be valued, and students typically in schools in the UK, don't they? They read a text like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde or A
mm,
Christmas Carol,
mm,
as 14, 15, 16 year olds, don't they, to answer questions, sort of analytical questions in
that's
a
right.
exam. Um, and this has been sort of viewed as kind of in quotes proper reading,
Mm.
whereas other types of reading, maybe we'll get onto that in a minute, is not seen that way. What's your thoughts on the sort of that demand, because you've lived with that as a head of English and now Nate's director, you
Mm.
know for many years, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, I think firstly, I should say there's obviously nothing wrong at all with wanting to read novels from pre-20th century, and
Yeah.
it's great. I mean, I think it's got a laudable thing to do. It can be a very pleasurable thing to do,
Mm.
but I think potentially the problem is that if that's then allowed to eclipse kind of other forms of
Yeah.
reading, that that can be an issue. And I think
Yeah.
the demand, because you've got kind of the two GCSEs. There's this demand that students should
Yeah.
read a 19th century non-fiction text on the English language paper
Yeah.
2 exam, as certainly as it is with AQA, and I know the exam boards will have their variant of that. Which I'm not entirely sure that there's necessarily value in that. I mean, I think certainly for non-fiction, students would be better served by having the chance to read more transactional texts or more contemporary literary non-fiction.
Yeah.
And so I do feel strongly about that. In terms of the GCSE literature, again, I don't have a problem necessarily with there being a requirement to study a 19th century literature text or pre-20th century, but what I think's kind of happened is this very narrowing of practice. So I've marked AQA's paper 2 as an examiner for a number of years, and you kind of essentially see that pretty much 98% of people are answering on A Christmas Carol or Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because I think what centres are doing is they're choosing the shortest, most accessible texts to teach.
Yeah.
But what students are then doing is usually kind of writing about them in very kind of rehearsed, kind of codified kind of ways. And so it doesn't really feel like there's any kind of learning that's happening. That's really about personal response. It's essentially learning a way of understanding the text and interpreting the text that you've essentially been taught how to do, and then you kind of regurgitate that in the exam. So I don't really kind of think that the demands of the exam are helping. I think that it will be. I think there are, I mean, in terms of the canon itself, and again, I think this is an interesting question because there are lots of people out there who are some of whom are quite influential in the world of English teaching who are very much on board with this notion of a canon. And but I think we've kind of got to unpick that though, because I think for me, it's a slightly regressive way of thinking about writing. I think it potentially, if we keep on focusing on the primacy of the canon as it's seen still, we risk kind of pushing to the margins the voices of writers who are maybe from the global majority, or writers who are from minority groups, or whatever your take is on that. But I think also it kind of enforces too, for literature, this notion that there's been this kind of very kind of neat progress and kind of a very linear kind of development of literature, when in actual fact literature doesn't really work like that. It's kind of messy. It's dialogic. Texts talk to each other, and to some extent the notion of a canon, I think, is something that's kind of been imposed on literature, and I'm not entirely sure that model really fits well with me. I think there's been a lot of since the kind of the early 20th century especially, and then as we kind of moved into that kind of the postmodern era, I think dismantling some of those, if you like, narratives of linear progression and those kind of meta narratives around that the canon represents are really important. So I personally would advocate for a model of curriculum and a national level where students are encouraged to be much wider in their reading, but also to think less about a canon that's a fixed thing, and actually to see literature as being something that's more kind of organic, and that sometimes is problematic or sometimes needs to be expanded upon. And I just think that's a more useful way of thinking about the literary canon.
And there is sort of, again, this argument, I mean, that rages in the community around relevance. Certainly my experience as an English teacher is that either you've got to make the kind of pre-20th century literature relevant to your students, or you've got to find texts that are, speaking to them. Any views on that? Maybe we could just move on to sort of, Nate has been really good at sort of championing new writers, isn't it? To be taught in schools, and poets and playwrights and young adult novelists, which are particularly relevant. But Nate, of course, covers primary schools too, doesn't it? Picture
Definitely.
books.
Yeah,
and
right.
certainly this is something at Goldsmiths we really promote. We have a master's in children's literature that Michael Rosen sort of heads up,
Yes,
and Dr. Emily Corbett, an expert in YA fiction. Just any thoughts on that, really?
Yeah, I think Nate, you're right. Has definitely kind of long championed the idea of the importance of writing for children,
Yeah.
and writing for young adults as well. And I sort of have always been interested in that as an undergraduate, and when I was doing my MA, where I did a bit of work, I remember, on David Armand, who I've always been a big fan of, and I think it's very important. I mean, I think there was a debate on Twitter last week. I think only last week, or X as it's now called, which I tend not to. I try and avoid it these days because it's a bit of a murky cesspool. But
Yeah.
occasionally I have a little a glimpse down beneath the murk. And there was something last week that people were kind of debating this notion of whether or not having children's literature and young adult fiction on a curriculum has any value at all. And I think relevance is important. I mean, and surely if you kind of discount the notion of relevance, then you're kind of taking out a really important component of what being a reader and being a writer is all about. I think that it's not necessary. It doesn't have to be. I mean, I think the argument was that, well, we can't possibly structure a curriculum around young adult fiction because that's just going to be teaching PSHE with novels, as if like all young adult fiction is somehow kind of issues based or something like that. And I think we shouldn't we shouldn't structure an English curriculum necessarily around kind of social issues of social issues or whatever. But I think relevance is fundamentally important. But that relevance comes from the I guess the artistic and literary merits of those texts and how they're responding to the times that we live in. And I don't think that there's any less relevance. I don't think there's anything less worthy of those texts. And my kind of perception of texts has always been extremely kind of I guess polycultural. Is that a phrase? I've coined a phrase, but kind of seeing kind of texts, whether it's film texts or other kinds of moving image, or graphic novels, or comic books, or kind of more conventional works of literature. I think all of these are really important parts of the dialogic and an organic kind of body of work that makes literature. And I think relevance is important, because if you can hear your own experiences being reflected, then that's going to make you engage much more with becoming a reader and a writer. And I don't think we should be denying young people that opportunity, especially given the fact that we've got we live in an increasingly multicultural and diverse society. And I think young people from all different parts of that should be able to hear and see their kind of experiences reflected.
Really, really great points. I mean, maybe we could move on to an even more controversial area. I should say that we are touching on things that do create huge debate, don't they, across the like you say, in X, and and that's around phones. I often actually get asked on the radio and TV to talk about mobile phones and whether they should be banned in schools. But one of the points I make, because I'm usually hired as the wishy-washy voice of liberalism, is that potentially they are an amazing resource, and I'm against banning them personally. But it's how they're used, and it's guiding young people to use them. And obviously people are reading them, and I think what Nate's view would be, they are a potential source of reading material. Obviously it's got to be material that is sort of constructively aligned with what the teacher wants the students to learn.
That's right.
Just any thoughts around that? Because Nate clearly does have a view, doesn't it? It does want to promote a sort of multimodal approach to reading.
Yes, that's right. That's right, yeah, and obviously, I've been talking about my own views about multimodal approaches to reading, and
Yeah.
Nate is a fairly broad church, but actually, it's always been, as we've said, a kind of a progressive voice, I think, in English teaching for sure.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so obviously, I will, but just put in the caveat that I've been talking about my own views to some extent, and
Yeah.
I think some of
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
probably would chime with members of Nate, but I won't claim to speak for all of the membership, but.
No. No.
But what I would say is that, yeah, but in terms of the phone issue, and I think sometimes it's kind of common sense needs to prevail sometimes, because
Yeah.
it is a great tool. I mean, it's a great tool, and you can use it for all kinds of stuff, whether it's kind of capturing images and storyboarding or recording audio. And I do recall that in the maybe the early the early years of smartphones, when it was still kind of a bit more permissible to do so, then you might kind of get sixth formers into groups doing various activities that involve their smartphones, and then they
Yeah.
might be uploading images and making a storyboard and then sharing it back with the class, and it felt like quite a liberating thing. And I know that, for example, in one or two schools in the area where I live, all students have an iPad, which is, a tool again that can be used
Yeah.
really well. And I think it's just maybe about kind of the kind of common sense, because if you're going to give all students unlimited access to their smartphone in class at any time, then yeah, of course they're going to kind of disengage probably with the learning.
Yeah.
So I think it's about kind of having kind of good structures in place, and expectations, and a culture where students are encouraged to use their devices productively, and
Yeah.
to understand that a lot of the time it may not be appropriate to have your device visible and out and about, just as like we wouldn't I'm not sat on my phone now while we're recording this interview, for example, scrolling,
Yeah.
doom scrolling. So
Yeah.
I guess it's just about it's teaching them that that's how we do things in the world, and that's it's a great tool, but you have to
Yeah.
kind of be wary of using it
Because
in
I
ways that
guess,
you don't
yeah, I
want to.
mean, it's interesting. We're moving on to sort of the next theme, isn't it? That a really good English teacher is teaching language awareness, isn't
Mhm.
it? And
Exactly.
so that language is just around us. We're just surrounded by it. It's not just a
Mhm.
narrow, looking at old books.
No,
Yeah, I mean, do you want to talk about that? Because I think Nate has sort of championed, hasn't it, this sort of contextual understanding of language.
definitely. Yeah, for sure. And I think, yeah, contextual understanding of language, and also I think the
Mm.
importance of language study as part of a English studies curriculum in school, because I think
Yeah.
that's been for me another, I guess, frustration maybe of where we're at nationally in terms of curriculum, is that I think
Mm.
literature has become very, very amplified. It's become almost within most
Mm.
departments, and I think this is perhaps because many
Mm.
English teachers are literature graduates, but I think
Yeah.
to some extent language has been kind of forced out of the curriculum,
Yeah.
and so you kind of get these departments who structure their entire curriculum around literary chronology. But but
Mm.
but I think Nate has always encouraged uh,
Mm.
kind of a much broader approach to English studies, where kind of learning about language in context, learning
Mm.
about linguistics, learning about spoken language and oracy is really, really important. And I think that needs to be. I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of
Yeah.
advocating for the importance of that in the curriculum, because
Yeah.
as you sort of said before, that can sometimes be about immersing students in a kind of, if you like, a rich
Mm.
experiential process of language learning, which is how we
Yeah.
learn. So it could be that when you're in class, when a student makes a response, you kind of take that response and you say, yeah, that's really good. And then you might say, so what we could also say to extend that is, and then you start bringing in kind of other forms of vocabulary, or other
Yeah.
kind of concepts. So I think it has to kind of almost again be part of that dialogue of
Mm.
the classroom, where you're kind of pitching high, and you're using kind of subject specific terminology, or you're using
Mm.
more accurate, pushing students to be more accurate in how they communicate. But I think that's kind of part of the culture of the classroom. It doesn't necessarily have to be.
Yeah.
It's in the it's in the pedagogy rather than the curriculum intent, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. So I think it's really important, definitely, that language studies
Mm.
is part of the curriculum planning, but it's also
Yeah.
just part of that, yeah, the classroom culture of
Yeah.
how we immerse students in language, and help them to become confident with new vocabulary and how to
Yeah.
apply new terminology.
Yeah. Yeah. No, really excellent points. I guess, that there is a kind of long lineage that goes back to the 1960s within NATE,
Yes.
you know, whereby you know there is a sort of idea that children themselves are experts in their own language, and so that goes back to things like the Bullock report in the 1970s,
That's right.
sort of where advocating the kind of valuing of home languages in school. Yeah, just really thoughts on that, because I guess that's sort of like a broader point, isn't it? That to parents who might be listening to the podcast, that enlightened to progressive English teaching does value all types of language. It doesn't, you know, NATE is not an organization that wants to necessarily be criticizing people for the way they speak, correcting in the way that English teachers are obliged to do, their grammar or their accent. That there is a sort of fundamental idea that children are experts in their own language, and they should be valued as in that way. I mean, which has become a very radical idea, hasn't it, in these really quite conservative times.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think you're right to acknowledge the kind of heritage there within it, in terms of those values. And I think you kind of mentioned the Bullock report, and I know I think Simon Gibbons, who's at University College London, he's done. Oh, no, sorry, no, he's not. He's at King. Apologies, I think he's at King's College actually.
King's, yeah.
Yeah, it's at King's, and he's sort of described NATE as having a kind of bottom-up way of working. And I think what he probably means by that is it's kind of taking English studies and finding it in the communities and networks where it kind of lives, because we all speak and read and write. Every community, every network does that in its own kind of unique way, and those networks are connected, all kind of interconnected. And in that respect, I think you have to value kind of locality. You have to value I guess I'd probably describe it as the valuing dialect, idiolect, and I think generally kind of valuing the diversity of language as much as the diversity of literature. Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point. And I think for me, kind of when I was being taught, when I was kind of growing up as a teenager, I can remember up in the northeast of England, I had some really great English teachers that were kind of fascinated by this notion of kind of the local and what it means, for example, to be a reader and a writer and a speaker and a listener who is connected, for example, to the northeast dialect, and how we kind of see ourselves in that. And I guess increasingly we've got our kind of, if you like, local communities are becoming more diverse in a whole bunch of other ways, and there's just so many great work that's been done. But I'd like to see that maybe being in classrooms in schools a bit more. I've read some fabulous stuff about, for example, things like kind of the dialects that emerge in other communities, like for example the gay community, when back in the 60s and 70s, certain kind of dialectal words or maybe dialectal words isn't the right phrase, but certain words and phrases kind of became important to communities who, if you like, felt marginalized. And I suppose you could say the same, about other different communities, whether it's ethnicities, or whether it's communities that exist because of being, kind of on the margins in other ways. And I think we should really value and explore and encourage students to learn about how language is essential to the identity of those communities and to the way that those communities can kind of celebrate those differences, really. Recently there's been a book that Lorna Smith has edited, which is the Generation Alpha book, which is a Nate Routledge publication, and what Lorna's done is looked at how there's some brilliant practice that's kind of taken place in very specific kind of either localities or not necessarily geographic localities, but locuses of community across the UK, and I think that's really important for young people now, because their perception of themselves isn't necessarily going to be informed just by locality or just by a kind of unified sense of what it means to be a young person living in one place. And I think what that book does is acknowledges that we can kind of better serve the emerging generations by helping them to understand not just the literature but the language and the kind of experiential sense of what it means to be a young person. So I think Nate is continuing, I feel, to value and to be and to explore and to encourage those elements of English language learning as well. And I think it's really important that we continue to advocate for the importance of language learning in the curriculum in secondary schools.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Just sort of moving on, and it's a related point. It's about the role of storytelling, because I think Nate has encouraged sort of spoken storytelling as well, hasn't it?
Definitely.
Within the classroom, and that valuing again children's voices in telling stories, telling jokes, telling anecdotes, and that again has a role in the English classroom and obviously in life too. Any thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there's so much there, and just to kind of, I read the other day that I can't remember where it was, but some corporate executive was hired who's essentially kind of in charge of storytelling, and I can't remember what my source was, so apologies that I can't quote my source, but I just thought that was really interesting, because I think increasingly we are living in a world where, well, maybe not increasingly, I think where we continue to live in a world where narrative is important, whether it's the stories that individuals tell about themselves or organizations or corporate organizations tell. And I think that's because narrative is so powerful. And I think that the way that people frame narratives now, probably isn't overly, there are evolutions, right? But the way we tell stories in some ways is kind of the same as we maybe always have done. So I think definitely that notion of kind of the power of storytelling, but also kind of the way that we transmit stories and the kind of the kind of oral tradition, and the way that that's aligned maybe now with the kind of culture, I suppose, of memes and kind of transmittable stories, and the way that those stories spread is really, really interesting for sure. And I've always encouraged students to, as a teacher, and again, this is kind of perhaps just my own opinion, but I think it aligns for sure with work that people who've been involved with Nate have done. But I've always kind of encouraged students to learn deeply the notion of narrative structure and archetypes, and to think about how they craft stories and how they can take ownership of stories. And when I was head of department, we used to publish a selection of our students' work on a blog, and that could have been fiction or it could have been non-fiction, but always with that kind of notion of storytelling and the way that we can kind of craft and manipulate and make choices in the stories that we tell. So I think it's really, really important. And you sort of see it everywhere now. And I think whether when someone stands up to make a TED talk or something like that, then framing the story is really important to the journey. So I think it's I'm kind of joking a little bit there, because everyone's on a journey now. Everyone's got a backstory, but of course, it's true. So I'm joking, but it's true. But so I just think teaching students how to be astute readers, but also astute writers, and having that awareness of how stories work is really important, definitely.
Definitely. And it's been really educative to talk to you. Maybe we could just sort of think about, to finish off, what is the kind of role of Nate in kind of supporting sort of community and teacher voice and research, in your view, moving forward?
Definitely, it's a great question, and I think Nate has always been a subject association that's kind of been a community of, primarily a community of teachers. And I know in the past, kind of a couple of decades ago, a bit like what I was saying before, I think Nate had a very kind of geographical thrust, and its kind of regional committees were really kind of influential. And I think what we're kind of saying now is a bit of a retooling of that, because none of us are really geographically restrained anymore. And you and I are kind of many miles apart, Francis, but we're here talking to each other, and I think that's how NATE is working. So we have working groups now rather than regional committees, and those working groups have themes, whether it's the LGBTQI plus working group that we're just launching at the moment, or the multicultural and diversity working group, or the ITE working group. And there's so many great things going on. So I would encourage people, if they're listening and they want to get involved with an aspect of English teaching, to check out the working groups, because those are the engine rooms, I guess, of NATE in that respect. But I think that community is really important. So one of the things I've been doing since I stepped into the role is taking the NATE website and making it more accessible, because I think we've got some fabulous content, and for previously members had to log into a slightly more closed down membership area, and we're in the process of bringing all of that content much more visibly online, and which is fabulous. But also engaging more with social media. We've got quite an active LinkedIn page now, and we're just kind of really trying hard to make sure that the expertise that's been built up over the years is there for people to access. And we've got some great membership options. I'm going into plug mode now. I'm sorry. Inevitably I've gone into kind of a bit of a plug for Nick, but I just think, membership is still such good value for money. I mean, I've been doing working on a little a landing page this week for new trainee teachers who'll be starting their courses in the next couple of weeks, and it's £1 a month for them to get full digital access to Teaching English magazine, to our research journal, English and Education, to our primary collaborative magazine, English 4 to 11. They can get discounted tickets for conference, and we're going to launch some online CPD as well. And I think what's good about all of this, and I will preface this by saying there are some brilliant individuals out there doing a lot of really good work and very visible on social media. And a lot of people now are offering things like CPD or kind of like resources that you can buy at their kind of TED shop or whatever it is. But I think what's great about NATE is that it's not about one person. It's not about me. It's not about you. It's not about any kind of ego. It's not about any individual. It's essentially a very kind of giving and a collective of people. And there's a huge amount of goodwill and a huge amount of support that's been built up. And everyone that I've worked with since I've taken on the job, I think to myself, wow, all of these people are really interested in giving something to this community. People are not in it for themselves. And I think that's what the strength of NATE is. It's a very plural and very kind of broad and very giving community. So I would really strongly encourage any of your listeners, if you're not a member of NATE, then do join. So it's £1 for trainee teachers, £3 for early career teachers, and £5 for digital access for classroom teachers. But you can still, of course, get a print subscription, and we're actually retooling Teaching English magazine, and it's going to have a fresh new design from the autumn. And I think that's quite nice too, sometimes having something physical that arrives at your door. And one of the things that I've been talking to the designer about is when people get Teaching English magazine, they might get it at home, and they might come home from a long day of teaching and be a bit tired, but actually when they kind of pick up the magazine, it's a special thing, because it's that kind of place where your professional life and your personal interests kind of cross over, really, and that can be quite invigorating. So I think the role of NATE is a community of practice and support for each other continues to be really strong. So I would encourage listeners to join if you are not a member.
Yeah, great. No, I'm certainly a member, and I would wholeheartedly endorse what you say.
Thank you.
Yeah, really do. Well, thank you so much, Anthony, for a really illuminating, a podcast interview, as it were. Really helpful, loads of topics to look at. And on the blog that I'll post alongside this podcast, I'll put kind of contact details of the website, and you can follow up from there.
Thank you very much, Francis. Yeah, what a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you very much.